Age 48 is the precise point where the person who has been investing intentionally gets to walk away on their own schedule, and the person who hasn't gets to walk away on their employer's schedule. The financial difference between those two outcomes, calculated precisely using current IRS contribution rules and a 7% annual return, amounts to $565,000 in retirement income that simply never materializes. All of it shaped by a 12-year window that opened years ago and is narrowing faster than nearly anyone appreciates. And that window is still open right now. According to ADP research analyzing more than 110 million payroll records, earnings reached their peak for the 45 to 54 age group with a median wage of $97,600, higher than every other cohort across the entire American workforce. That is the income environment you're currently operating in. And at the same time, the stretch between 46 and 61 is supposed to be the period when peak earnings, reduced household obligations, and years of accumulated compounding finally start pulling in the same direction. So far, that sounds promising. Here's the problem. Half of Americans who have been saving for retirement have built up 3 times or less of their annual income, falling dramatically short of the Fidelity benchmark of 6 to 8 times salary by ages 50 to 60. You are earning more than you ever have. You are also behind by a wider margin than you have ever been. And the one resource that could bridge that gap, time, is now the very thing running out. This video is about why 48 is the specific year where that collision either gets resolved or gets permanently locked in. There are 4 forces converging simultaneously at this age, and I'm going to walk you through each one, what each costs you if you ignore it, and 3 concrete actions you can take immediately, calibrated specifically for someone in your exact position in 2026. Not generic advice about saving more. Actual structural moves with precise figures sourced directly from the IRS and from 5 decades of retirement research. But before the numbers, let me give you the framework that makes all of it land properly. NASA uses a concept called the launch window. It refers to the specific period during which a spacecraft must lift off to successfully complete its mission. The window is governed entirely by orbital mechanics, where the planets are positioned, what trajectories are physically available, what trajectory will deliver the spacecraft to its destination. Miss the window and you don't simply reschedule the launch. You wait months, sometimes years. In some cases, the mission never happens at all. What makes launch windows genuinely unsettling is that they appear identical from the inside, regardless of which side of the line you're on. The day before the window and the day after the window look and feel exactly the same. The rocket is fueled. The crew is ready. Everything appears to be proceeding normally, but on one side of that narrow opening, a viable mission exists. On the other side, you have a very expensive machine sitting on a pad going nowhere. Age 48 is a launch window. The orbital mechanics are specific, measurable, and temporary. I'm going to show you precisely what they are and exactly when each one closes. Hold that image. I'll return to it at each time we reach a new dimension of this conversation. In a few minutes, I'll show you career headwind data that most people at 48 have never actually quantified, and why that data reshapes the entire timeline of every decision you think you have time to approach gradually. But first, let me show you why right now, this specific year, you are sitting inside a combination of financial conditions that will never align again in quite this configuration. The IRS establishes 401k contribution limits annually. For 2025, the standard deferral limit sits at $23,500, with a catch-up contribution limit of $7,500 for those aged 50 and older. For 2026, the standard deferral limit rises to $24,500, and the catch-up limit for those 50 and above increases to $8,000. The moment you turn 50, you can direct $32,500 per year into a tax-advantaged retirement account. And then it gets more interesting. Participants who are 60, 61, 62, or 63 years old by the end of a given calendar year can contribute up to $11,250, surpassing the standard catch-up limit available to those merely 50 and above. This enables a total annual 401k contribution of $35,750 in 2026. Here's what almost no one explains about catch-up contributions. The people who use them most effectively are not individuals who suddenly discovered them at age 60. They are people who built momentum in their late 40s. The super catch-up is an accelerant, not the engine itself. The engine has to already be running. At 48, 2 years before the first expansion becomes available, and 12 years before the super catch-up, you are inside the final window where you can build that engine, while still operating at peak income with full career stability intact. Now, here is the pattern interrupt that reframes everything else in this video. Fidelity's widely cited benchmark suggests workers should have roughly 6 times their annual salary saved by age 50 and 8 times by age 60. 6 times salary by 50. If you're earning anywhere near the median for your age group, call it $100,000, you need $600,000 saved within the next 2 years just to be considered on track. The average Gen X 401k balance, according to Fidelity's fourth quarter 2025 analysis of its 24.8 million plan participants, stands at $222,100. That is 2.2 times salary measured against a target of 6 times. These are not two separate populations being compared against each other. This is the same generation measured against its own benchmark. The gap is not a rounding error. It is $378,000 per household, and it is growing, not shrinking, because of everything I'm about to explain. The window is open right now. Stay with me, because what comes next fundamentally changes the timeline of every decision you currently believe you have the luxury of approaching gradually. This is not about investment returns. It's about job security. And specifically, when yours actually ends. Approximately 2/3, 64%, of workers aged 50 and above report having witnessed or personally experienced age discrimination in the workplace, a proportion that has remained unchanged since 2024. In fact, 22%, in both 2024 and 2025, report feeling actively pushed out of their current position because of their age. And across a broader data compilation drawing from multiple studies, 56% of workers over 50 are involuntarily displaced from long-held jobs before they ever choose to retire. More than half of people over 50 do not leave the workforce on their own terms. And before you conclude this applies to someone other than you, consider when it actually begins. Age-related bias starts being felt by employees as early as their late 30s and early 40s in certain industries. The inflection point for most professional workers falls somewhere between 50 and 55. If you are 48, you have a window of roughly 2 to 7 years of full career control remaining. That is not a fear-based claim. That is the statistical distribution of when this transition tends to occur. You may believe the primary financial risk at 48 is not having saved enough. That concern is legitimate. But the actual greatest risk is being involuntarily separated from your peak earning position at 53 and needing to access retirement funds 5 to 7 years ahead of schedule. When that happens, two problems emerge at exactly the same moment. First, you lose the contributions you were counting on making. If you intended to contribute $32,500 per year from age 50 through 65, but exit your career at 53, you have just forfeited $325,000 in planned contributions, before accounting for any growth those dollars would have generated. Second, you are forced to begin drawing down a portfolio that was never fully constructed, which triggers the sequence of returns problem I'll explain shortly. There's a story that circulates in retirement research circles about a senior marketing director, 15 years with a Fortune 500 company, 52 years old, whose department was reorganized. She was offered a consulting arrangement at a fraction of her previous compensation. She spent 18 months searching for a comparable position and never found one. In every interview, she was told the organization wanted someone who could grow with the company. She was 53. She had planned to retire at 62. She ultimately accessed her 401k at 56, 4 years ahead of schedule, with a portfolio structured for long-term accumulation, not for early withdrawal. The sequence of returns damage began immediately. Her situation is far from exceptional. Nearly three-quarters of older Americans, 74%, believe their age could represent a barrier to securing new employment, according to a January 2025 survey conducted by AARP. By the way, if you find this useful, please subscribe. The algorithm is designed to stop showing you content unless you actively signal otherwise. It takes 2 seconds and keeps these videos appearing in your feed. This is where the generational dimension of this story becomes inseparable from the financial argument. Gen X is the first generation to navigate retirement primarily through defined contribution plans, shifting an enormous degree of individual responsibility onto people who never asked for it and were never specifically trained for it. Simultaneously, many members of this generation are managing financial obligations in multiple directions, supporting aging parents while still providing for dependent children, the classic sandwich generation dynamic. More than half, 54% of Gen Xers born between 1965 and 1980 doubt they will be financially prepared for retirement when the time arrives. According to Northwestern Mutual's 2025 Planning and Progress study, Gen Xers estimate they will need $1.57 million to retire comfortably, $310,000 above the national average retirement target. They understand they need more. They are behind on accumulating it, and they are inside the launch window right now, attempting to navigate it while managing financial pressure coming from 4 directions at once. 1 in 5 Gen X adults has already been forced by financial setbacks to push back their planned retirement date. Not a projected risk, but already happened. Already. Here's the piece that never appears inside a retirement calculator. Knowing the contribution limits, understanding the salary curves, absorbing the age discrimination data, and actually constructing a system around all of it are 2 entirely different things. Over the past decade, working alongside accountants and financial attorneys, a framework was built to answer the specific question this video raises. What do you actually do with this information? That work became something called the Exit Code, a digital book grounded in 50 years of actual retirement data. Not opinion, not motivational content. The mathematics of what demonstrably works. 2 elements inside it are directly relevant to what has been discussed here. The first is what's called the 58% rule. The specific financial buffer needed between your planned retirement date and your actual point of financial independence, constructed specifically for the scenario where your career ends before you choose it to. The second is the dynamic withdrawal method, which replaces the static 4% rule with a framework that genuinely accounts for what happens when sequence of returns risk strikes early in retirement. Both of those concepts are about to become very relevant as this video continues. It costs less than dinner out for 2 people. The link is in the description. It was built to be something actually worth using because everything else available was either too broad or quietly designed to serve someone else's financial interests. Now, back to the math your financial advisor will never place on a presentation slide. There is a number sitting in the gap between your planned retirement date and your Medicare eligibility that almost no one includes in their retirement projections. It is not dramatic in name, it is simply money, and the amount is specific. According to Fidelity Investments' 2025 retiree healthcare cost estimate, the average 65-year-old who retired in 2025 will spend approximately $172,500 on healthcare and medical expenses across retirement, not including long-term care. That figure assumes you reach 65 and Medicare begins on schedule. Here is where the arithmetic becomes genuinely punishing for anyone who exits their career early, voluntarily or otherwise. At the end of 2025, the enhanced premium tax credits that had been suppressing ACA marketplace premiums since 2021 expired and were not extended into 2026. For early retirees, this means the subsidy cliff at 400% of the federal poverty level has returned. Anyone earning above roughly $62,600 as a single person in 2026 pays the full unsubsidized price for marketplace coverage, which can exceed $1,500 per month at age 62 in certain rating areas. $1,500 per month per person. For a couple, that figure reaches $3,000 per month, or $36,000 annually, purely in health insurance premiums. before a single copay, deductible, or prescription cost is added. Even at a more conservative estimate of $1,000 per month per person, a couple retiring before Medicare eligibility faces $24,000 per year in insurance costs alone. Across 5 years, from age 60 to 65, that amounts to $120,000 in healthcare spending that simply does not appear in most retirement calculators, is absent from standard projection documents, and never surfaces in the planning conversations advisors have with clients at 45. It appears on the day employer coverage ends, and by that point, the only asset available to absorb it is the retirement account that was needed for everything else. Health insurance represents one of the largest expenses individuals face when retiring before 65. Monthly premiums in the range of $1,000 to $1,100 per person can meaningfully compress how long retirement savings last, particularly when combined with housing, food, and transportation. Because these costs arrive before Medicare eligibility, early retirees frequently need to account for multiple years of elevated healthcare spending when evaluating whether their retirement timeline is actually financially viable. Here's what you do about this at 48 specifically. One option worth serious consideration is a health savings account. If you are enrolled in a qualifying high-deductible health plan, you can direct pre-tax dollars into an HSA and deploy those funds for qualified medical expenses. In 2026, the contribution limit is $4,400 for individual coverage and $8,750 for family coverage. Unlike a 401k, an HSA carries a triple tax advantage. Contributions enter pre-tax, growth accumulates tax-free, and withdrawals for qualified medical expenses come out tax-free as well. If the balance remains unspent at 65, the account converts to function essentially like a standard investment account. Non-medical withdrawals are subject to ordinary income tax, consistent with a traditional IRA. But critically, if you begin investing HSA contributions at 48 and allow them to compound, you are constructing a dedicated healthcare buffer across 17 years. The early retirees who navigate the pre-Medicare gap with the least financial strain are not necessarily the highest earners. They are the individuals who began building this specific buffer early enough for compounding to make it sufficient. There is a structural wrinkle here that most people overlook entirely. For early retirees managing ACA marketplace coverage, retirement income must be managed carefully, not minimized as a blanket rule, but deliberately calibrated. Anyone earning above roughly $62,600 as a single person in 2026 pays full marketplace price. That means a single retirement withdrawal, say an IRA distribution larger than anticipated that pushes taxable income above that threshold, could trigger an additional $10,000 to $12,000 per year in health insurance costs. That is not a tax problem. That is a structural problem. And structural problems get solved 17 years before they arrive, not 3. This is precisely why the composition of your retirement accounts matters at 48 in ways it simply did not at 35. How much sits in pre-tax 401k accounts? How much in Roth? How much in an HSA? How much in taxable brokerage accounts? You are designing your retirement income tax situation right now. It may not feel that way, but you are. Every contribution decision made today is a design decision about the income architecture you'll inhabit in retirement. Everything described so far assumes a reasonably linear story. Accumulate, retire, withdraw, and sustain. But there is one final element that reshapes the mathematics of everything previously discussed. And it specifically penalizes people who exit their careers earlier than planned, with portfolios never structured for early departure. Research by Wade Pfau at the American College of Financial Services has directly quantified something most retirement projections smooth over entirely. The compounded return in the first 10 years of retirement accounts for approximately 77% of the final retirement outcome. Not the 30 years of accumulation, not the investment selections made across a career. The first decade of withdrawals. This is sequence of returns risk. Picture 2 retirees, each beginning with a $1 million portfolio. Both withdraw identical amounts each year. Both earn the same average annual return across a 30-year retirement. The only variable is the order in which their annual returns arrive. One encounters several down years early, followed by strong growth later. The other experiences robust growth early and declining years toward the end. The retiree who faces turbulence in the opening years can deplete their portfolio far sooner, even though long-term average returns are mathematically identical between them. The mechanism is not complicated. It is simply relentless. Unlike generalized market risk, sequence risk targets specifically the people who are actively withdrawing from their portfolio. When you liquidate investments during a market decline to cover living expenses, those shares are permanently gone. They cannot participate in any subsequent recovery. If the market falls 20% in your first year of retirement, your portfolio contracts to $800,000, and your next withdrawal now represents a larger percentage of what remains. That compounding effect in the wrong direction can reduce your retirement horizon by years. Here is how this connects back to age 48 in a way that completes the entire argument. Sequence risk is most concentrated in the opening decade of retirement. If you retire at 65 as planned, your vulnerable decade runs from 65 to 75, a period when you are hopefully in good health, Social Security has activated, and Medicare is handling healthcare costs, manageable with adequate preparation. But if you are displaced from your career at 53, which the data shows happens to more than half of workers, your vulnerable decade begins 12 years earlier than anticipated, with a portfolio that hasn't been fully assembled before Social Security becomes accessible, and with healthcare costs potentially consuming $36,000 annually. That is the compounding of every risk discussed in this video, arriving simultaneously in the worst possible sequence. Research by Kitches, Pfau, and others suggests that the first decade of retirement carries the highest concentration of sequence risk. If a retiree navigates this window without severe early declines, the remaining portfolio generally withstands later volatility, because ongoing withdrawals have progressively reduced the dollar magnitude of the exposure. The problem is not market volatility in general, it is early volatility combined with early withdrawals hitting at the same time. Protecting against this requires lead time. Researchers describe what is sometimes called a bond tent approach, temporarily carrying a higher fixed income allocation through the early retirement years to avoid being forced to sell equities at depressed prices, then gradually reintroducing equity exposure as the highest risk sequence window passes. The specific tactic matters less than the underlying principle. You must build deliberately toward this structure years in advance. You need to know where your cash buffer resides at 48, so that when you exit your career, on your timeline or someone else's, you do not walk into the highest risk phase of your retirement financially exposed. The launch window connects all four forces. At 48, you still have the time to build the buffer. You still have the income to fund it. You still have the career stability to act without operating in crisis mode. 3 years from now, 2 of those conditions may no longer hold. 7 years from now, potentially none of them will. Here is where this becomes concrete, because abstract retirement arguments are precisely how people end up doing nothing. Marcus is 48. He works as a project manager at a mid-sized company in Dallas. He earns $100,000 per year. He has $220,000 in his 401k, slightly above the average Gen X balance according to Fidelity's Q for 2025 data, but substantially below the 6-times salary benchmark. Fidelity says he needs to reach by age 50. Marcus has 2 paths available to him. In the first path, Marcus maximizes his 401k beginning this year at $24,500 annually. At 50, he adds the catch-up contribution and raises his annual total to $32,500. At 60, under the Secure 2.0 Act's super catch-up provision, he pushes that figure to $35,750 through age 63, then returns to the standard catch-up rate for his final working year before retiring at 65. At a 7% annual return, conservative relative to historical S&P 500 averages and accounting for fees and a moderate bond allocation, Marcus's 401k grows to approximately $1.67 million. The figure Americans identify as what they need to retire comfortably in 2026 is $1.46 million. Marcus surpasses it. Under a 4% withdrawal rate, he draws $66,000 per year, sufficient to cover healthcare, housing, and a reasonable standard of living, particularly with Social Security providing supplemental income. In the second path, Marcus does what most people in his exact situation actually do. He contributes enough to capture the employer match, roughly $5,000 per year, and tells himself he'll become serious about retirement savings once the children are through college and the mortgage balance is lower. By the time he reaches 58 and finally begins maximizing contributions, his account has grown to approximately $452,000. He maximizes contributions across the remaining 7 years before retirement, taking full advantage of both the standard 50-plus catch-up and the super catch-up from 60 through 63. At 65, Marcus arrives with approximately $1.1 million. Not negligible, but not sufficient. The gap between Path 1 and Path 2 is $565,000. That is not a computational error. That is a life outcome differential created entirely by what Marcus chose to do between the ages of 48 and 57. Same income, same market conditions, same retirement date. Under the 4% rule, Path 1 delivers Marcus $66,000 per year. Path 2 delivers $44,000 per year. That $22,000 annual difference, sustained across a 20-year retirement, represents $440,000 in total income that the Path 2 version of Marcus never receives. You know what an extra $22,000 per year actually represents in lived experience? It is the difference between flying to see your grandchildren and waiting for them to drive to you. It is the difference between addressing healthcare gaps without anxiety and spending your early retirement calculating whether you can afford a procedure. It is the difference between having genuine options and not having them, and the window is open right now. Here's what most Americans actually do during their peak earning years in their late 40s. They buy the car, the one they've been promising themselves since they could finally afford it, which is genuinely understandable. They earned it, but they are then surprised when the retirement projection doesn't add up. The car payment and the investment account are both competing for the same dollars at the same time. And one of them has compound interest working in your favor while the other has it working against you. Both figures are technically growing, just in opposite directions. Here is the numbered framework. 3 windows are closing simultaneously at age 48. The first is the income window. Peak earnings arrive for workers aged 45 to 54, with a median wage of $97,600. Higher than any other age bracket. Beyond this range, wages begin to flatten and then decline for workers between 55 and 64, and decline further still beyond that. The income window is not permanent. It is a curve with a peak, and the peak is now. The second is the contribution window. At 50, the catch-up contribution opens an additional $8,000 of tax-sheltered capacity per year. At 60, the super catch-up adds another $3,250 on top of that. Catch-up contributions represent one of the most powerful acceleration tools available in the retirement savings arsenal, but their power is multiplied by the base already in place. They are an accelerant. You have to build the engine first, now. The third is the compounding timeline.